Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics, or are your politics starting to shape your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have with us Mr. Todd McFarland, Deputy General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have with us Mr. Tim Schultz, who's the president of the First Amendment Partnership. We have also with us Mr. Andre Wong, who's the General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have Dr. Timothy Golden, who's a professor of philosophy at Whitman College. Gentlemen, great having you here with us. Looking forward to our discussions today. You know, something that's been really troubling as it relates to Christianity and other religious groups, it seems as though Christians in particular in Europe are starting to face a rising amount of discrimination and hate crimes. It really threw me off when I saw that there were nuns who had to start taking self-defense classes, and after repeatedly having to call the police, for protection, these nuns who were living in France decided that it was escalating so badly that they decided to move completely to a whole nother country. They decided to move to the UK. However, in the UK, there seemed to be a lot of terrible activities from a discrimination standpoint. We have beatings, we have spitting, we have insults. I mean, we're getting to the point where we have roommates that are actually continuing to have fights, telling that someone deserves to die because they renounced their former religion. It appears as though there are thousands of these type of activities that are happening in Europe. France seems to be leading the way with over 1,700 of these different incidents. The UK has probably close to 800 of these incidents. And these are the types of things that are now being reported. We are now trying to document to find out what we can do about this. But Tim Golden, when we start taking a look of things that are happening, maybe on the other side of the pond, the idea, well, maybe we don't need to worry about that. But generally what's happening in that backyard could be in your backyard, in particular from a global perspective, from a social media perspective. But if I've got nuns having to take self-defense classes because of their religious beliefs, where do we go next with this?
Well, you're right in that Dr. King often said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So when we see this kind of sort of anti-religious violence taking place in other parts of the world, it's not the kind of thing that we should just shrug off and say, oh, it's not happening here. I think what we have to understand is that in part, I think because of the influences on us through social media and other forms of technology, we have to understand that the kind of hostility that is engendered against people because they're religious or because of whatever characteristic we don't like, that the potential for that is really very, very high, right? And it's so high because we live in these social media silos that isolate us from the rest of the world. And we can, through a few minutes of scrolling on our phone, become convinced that nuns are the incarnation of evil, right? And that they need to be stopped in some way, right? I mean, we had just a few years ago, someone during the 2016 election who actually believed that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex trafficking ring out of a pizzeria basement in Washington, D.C., and drove up there and shot someone. So we have to begin to be more responsible with the information that we absorb. And we have to understand that just because someone holds religious beliefs that you may find objectionable for whatever reason, I suspect that a lot of this violence against religious people is perpetrated in complete ignorance of what religious people actually believe or actually do, right? It's fueled by a sort of propaganda machine that we often create ourselves by only following or only liking I mean, the algorithm gives us what we like and who we follow. And if those people are wrong, then you just have a community of people who are wrong. And when you decide to act on wrong information, this is the kind of thing that happens. So we have to really try to be more responsible. And how about if you took the time to learn what an order of nuns actually believes or actually does, instead of committing acts of violence against them, you may be trying to figure out the best way to help them.
So, Orland, I just have a couple thoughts here. One is I think that when we hear about these stories, they seem so rare in the United States, and that hasn't always been the case, right? Yeah. We've had lots of periods of anti-religious violence perpetrated, especially against religious minorities in the United States in our history. And I think we ought to get more in touch with that history, but also just say it's a blessing that that history is largely behind us. Here's what's not behind us: human nature, right? Human nature is the same as it was at any period of gross religious violence in history. And there's another factor here. We talk about, social media, and I think Dr. Golden is right about everything he said, but this is a public affairs program, but I know all of us believe that it's true that there is this mysterious thing called principalities and powers. The unseen evil that acts upon the wills of human beings, perhaps not to outright possession, but in terms of a mysterious influence. And I think if you look at any anti-religious violence, when the veil is sort of pulled away and we're able to see everything clearly, I think we'll see that often in these cases, maybe almost all of the time, there's some sort of principality and power at work. This is really evil. We're not just wrestling with flesh and blood here. And when you hear nuns being attacked and spit on, I don't think that's just mere human evil. I think there's something else human evil is cooperating with there.
Well, I got to ask you, Andre, there's a question that some people will have to say that some people who are leading these religious organizations have a certain pious nature to them, that sometimes they give you the feel of we are better than you. And with the idea that that may be the case, is it also some responsibility on the side of religious leaders or even those who espouse their religious viewpoints to really make sure that you're doing it in a way that's not attacking someone?
Right. And whether it's intended or not, Christians have perhaps a perception of being in power. In society, in politics, in business, and this may be in Europe, and so maybe you're right. Maybe Christians have a public relations issue in a world where everything is reduced to a 30-second influencer reel. Perhaps this is an opportunity for a rebranding campaign. But really, how to deal with this as a Christian is to be Christian. And I want to just kind of look at the broad scope of this. This isn't just a onesie twosie situation. I mean, this is almost 2,500 incidents of anti-Christian hate crimes in 35 countries, and like you said, France, UK, Germany. These are countries that we would think are friendly and the most tolerant. And so as we look at these incidents of not just violence. I mean, this is discrimination and bullying, even loss. People are losing their jobs. I think it is worth kind of looking at what's the root cause. As far as the perception of Christians in that society.
Todd, here in the United States, we're seeing issues where the federal government is putting funds in place so that churches can have protection. So, it seems as though here in the U.S. we're seeing it, but if it rises to a point where the federal government has to start allotting resources for the protections of house of worship, it seems as though that this seems to be a problem that it looks like it's not going to tamp down. It looks like it's getting worse. I mean, we talk about some of these countries, some of those numbers doubled from year to year, which means that, very soon a multiplying effect on this could be, extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, causes of this are probably not fully understood. They can also be very uncomfortable because you're often dealing with immigrant groups, either immigrant groups as the perpetrators or immigrant groups as the victims, and both of that happens. We saw that in France and other places with attacks like, and this wasn't religion, but Charlie Hebdo attacks, and when you have individuals coming from countries in which there are no expectations of religious freedom or in a belief in violence, then those beliefs cross the border with them. You also then have, even amongst people who may have been in the country and sort of, attack on people who are coming in because they resent them. But those are very uncomfortable things to talk about. And it does, I think, go to, we need to embrace as a society this idea of freedom of decision making. But especially in Islam, there is this idea you cannot convert, that is just considered wrong, and it is punishable by death in many Muslim countries, and it is certainly socially unacceptable. There may be some tolerance for Christians, but not for Muslims who convert. And that's going to take a change in society and the heart, not just government regulation and laws.
Well, Orlin, you mentioned the need for houses of worship to be fortified. I mean, the houses of worship in the United States that most take advantage of those federal sort of institutional hardening programs are synagogues. And unfortunately, we've seen a rash of anti-Semitism in the United States in the aftermath of October 7th. That's probably the worst thing I've seen in terms of anti-religious bigotry. So you see American-born college students sort of chanting or sort of really openly wishing for the death of Jews just because they're Jews. And that, again, is back to my earlier point that I have a hard time explaining this entirely without some reference to the sort of nebulous evil of the principalities and powers. I don't have to know exactly how to explain them scientifically to know that they exist and that they're operating in conjunction with ordinary human evil.
And if I could just chime in here, we didn't get to this point overnight, right? Certainly I can speak for the United States as someone who is the product of a Catholic school education. The way that I view a nun when I see a nun is going to be very different than the way a 20-year-old zealot on social media who thinks Catholics are evil because they're anti-abortion is going to see a nun, right? Yeah. And over these several generations, I think one of the things that's happened is the displacement of certain types of education, of religious educational forms in general, which used to be formative for lots of American children. Again, like me, I attended Catholic school growing up. So nuns always will have for me a certain kind of special reverence. And when we start to decenter religion, and then when we see the development of our politics becoming so deeply polarized over issues like abortion, it becomes easy to impute evil to people who have absolutely nothing to do with that. And I think that we have to pay attention to those kinds of societal trends.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but I think the points that we are really getting to in particular is what we see happening internationally is injustice for one is still injustice for all. And we have to speak up when we see evil, no matter where it is. There's a recent case called the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventists versus Horton, in which the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which is led by this General Conference, is a Christian denomination that many of you know that has probably over 22 million members on a worldwide basis. And it's an organization that believes that in order to fulfill its requirements and uphold its religious mission, that these are certain things that we want to do for our employees and individuals who affiliate with us that are leading more men and women towards Christ in a lifestyle that we're comfortable with. There was a recent change in Maryland law, however, that threatens some of this freedom, and it relates to the General Conference and hiring employees that may disagree with the church's faith and religious mission. The change in Maryland law actually disrupted some long-held beliefs that the church can hire individuals who only have the beliefs and the what I would call the convictions of being a Seventh-day Adventist. Well, what has happened is this has changed the law a little bit. It comes down to the idea that there are certain jobs that can happen at a church or at a religious organization that may not be necessary to advance the mission of that religion. And as a result thereof, we shouldn't have that requirement in place. You know, Todd, in some ways I can almost see where this conversation got started and the questions that somebody may have. The idea that you may say, well, the person who's doing the landscaping outside or somebody who removes the snow, and then even talking about even some of the work inside the building, contractors. Does it sound like people are concerned that this is more of an isolationist from a religion standpoint? Or is this really some employment issues that really need to be looked at in a way to protect the church from issues going down the road?
Orland, this really comes down to a question of, can a faith community decide who is going to conduct its work, and not just its ministers, not just its teachers, but from the bottom up. And we believe the Constitution gives us that right. The government, that the legislatures in Annapolis and the Supreme Court of Maryland, who are the ones that created this problem, do not get to tell the Seventh-day Adventist Church how it spends its members' tithe money and who it hires to conduct its work. And we believe that all of our employees are furthering the gospel and the mission. Many of them take great financial sacrifice. They take a reduced pay working here. It's not because they hate money. It's because they support the work of the church. And for the state of Maryland to come in and say that it knows better than us who and what can be our employees and conduct our mission and who's critical to it and who it's not is just a huge overreach, and quite frankly, nothing more than judicial hubris that they know best what is for the church.
Yeah, I would just note, and Todd, being a lawyer, knows this, that in the leading Supreme Court case on the rights of religious organizations under federal non-discrimination law to hire who they want to do, this is this case called Presiding Bishop of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints versus Amos. In that case, the employee at issue was a custodial worker. And the Church of Jesus Christ had a reasonable belief. They wanted their custodial workers to be meaningful practitioners of the faith. And again, other organizations, religious denominations may take a different view of that. Fine. But lots of religious organizations have what they want to have, a thick community where they don't treat the custodial worker as different than the teacher. That's actually part of the egalitarianism of their beliefs. They say, we're not going to have this clerisy of people who teach the religion, and then we're going to treat the so-called janitorial staff as lesser or as just doing janitorial work. We believe that all work is God's work, right? And that means the guy that cleans up the toilets is doing God's work too. And they have a right to say that. Now, that wasn't really at issue in that case, but I just think it really is worth thinking about, is from the inside of a religious organization, you really do think that everybody there matters, everybody there is part of the mission. And this idea that's being imposed from outside, that there's sort of God's work and then there's secular work, that's not the idea of the religious organizations. That's a secular idea being imposed on religious organizations.
Yeah, I think in situations like this, with the church functioning as an employer, that you do get to set the terms of employment. A question I would have, and Todd, I'm curious to see how you would answer this question. I'm going to go into law school mode with a hypothetical here. Suppose instead of hiring an individual landscaper, the church said that it was only going to contract with landscapers who were owned or managed by Seventh-day Adventists. Would the church have the same kind of legal standing that they have as an employer with independent contractors?
Yep.
So that's a good question, Tim. And the answer is we simply don't know the answer to it, because to the best of my knowledge, other than 1981, which protects contracting on the basis of race, there's no other protection, federal or state, on contractors. So we would be free to contract only with Seventh-day Adventist contractors. To be clear, we don't do that.
Right.
And it wouldn't even be we wouldn't have to invoke a constitutional right. We would only, there is no law, federal or state, that prohibits that. So it is an interesting question, I guess, like from a law school hypothetical, but to the best of my knowledge, other than 1981, the federal statute, the Civil War era, post-Civil War era statute, you're free to contract with whoever you want, other than you can't discriminate on the basis of race.
But Andre, what's interesting here, if I can contract with whoever I want, so maybe the janitorial staff that's working, in a religious organization and is really interacting with everyone in every office, on every floor, the idea that that group does not have to, quote unquote, be part of the mission. I mean, it seems as though that actually is part of the issue that the courts are trying to come to grips with, that who's part of the mission and who's not part of the mission. And are we simply trying to draw a nuance between employment law and individuals being contractors, in which you got 1099s instead of W-2s, which sounds like that's almost playing one side against the other for what you may want to make sure you get the best talent.
Yeah, and oftentimes, I will say most times, the support staff is the front face of the organization. They're the ones that are greeting people at the front door or answering the phones. They are the point of contact of the organization from the outside. And virtually all organizations today, religious and non-religious, have mission, vision, and value statements. And everyone that's hired, from the corporate leadership on down, is expected to subscribe and perpetuate those mission, vision, and values. And it's like the story of JFK going to NASA, meeting the janitor, right? And when President Kennedy asks him, what do you do here? The janitor replies, "Sir, I'm helping put a man on the moon." Likewise, religious organizations are entitled to have all employees share and uphold their belief, the church's beliefs, and it goes without saying again. I mean, the longstanding jurisprudence that courts stay out of questions of the church's core mission, and what employees are essential to advancing that mission. So I think that this is something that I'm sure other states are watching. They're watching Maryland to see how this plays out.
So, Orland, two things I'd like to specify. First, just to clarify on the contracting issue. Organizations, especially at our scale and scope, when we do contract out for things, whether that be janitorial, whether that be security, whether that be landscaping, whatever, the people actually doing the works are not getting 1099s. They're getting W-2s. You contract with a company, and then they hire employees and so on. And, an organization like this have contractors all across, right? Electrical people coming in, plumbing people, all kinds of stuff. And, you have to draw a line, and the line that we draw is at employment. The second thing I want to talk about is, and this is important, is if, the Maryland Supreme Court were on here, what they would say is, well, we're protecting employees, right? That employees, that's the job of the government. I want to stress how narrow this exemption is. Employees still have, the class employees they're talking about, which are non-ministerial, support personnel, still have their protection on race. They still have their protection for gender. They have their protection for color, national origin, for disability, harassment, which is part of the sex discrimination. All the other categories, other than the ones that there's an exemption for, which are very narrow, they still have protection on. So this idea that it leaves the employees just unprotected and the employer can do whatever it wants willy-nilly just does not line up with the nature of the exemption that we're advocating for, and that used to exist before the Maryland Supreme Court reinterpreted state law.
But Tim Golden, what makes this a little bit tricky is that we're almost back to the point, and Todd and myself find engaging in activities where we have to go out and actually create a brand to explain to people what this church really is all about. Because it seems like when you read this opinion, the opinion actually gives the impression that there is a viewpoint in society that if you work for this particular organization, you're being discriminated against in a way that's outside of any protections of the law. And, and I remember one time the LDS church started doing a lot more advertising, and it seemed as though that advertising that they were doing, on a national basis really kind of tamped down people's viewpoints of the LDS church. And I'm wondering, are churches now going to have to get in the business of branding and marketing so that society has a better idea of who they are?
Absolutely. I was watching a football game over the weekend, and a church for the Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints came on during the game, right? Churches are always going to be engaged in a very intense struggle for self-definition, because if you do not define yourself, particularly in a culture and a society that has very strong anti-religious sentiments and a very strong anti-religious ethos, then the society will define you for yourself, right? So I do think it's incumbent upon churches in this day and age to market themselves, to define themselves through that marketing, through that branding, if you will, because if churches and other religious organizations don't define themselves, they will end up defaulting to a definition that is completely at odds with who you really are as a religious group and what you really do. And references in a judicial opinion are not really what churches are all about, and they're not going to give that accurate depiction.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but I think we are moving into a time where you can't just call yourself religious or call yourself Christian without actually going out and explaining to the world what that means. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this taking place as society makes its own decisions on who we are. Hey, Andre, tell me something I don't know.
Actually, Todd McFarland probably knows this one. Silver Spring, Maryland, which is the home of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, is the 5th largest city in Maryland, but is unincorporated.
Tim Golden, tell me something I don't know.
The legal scholar Hadley Arks published a book in 2023 called Mere Natural Law, styled after the great C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. The book argues that contemporary originalism, untethered from classical natural law theory, leads to an incoherence in constitutional adjudication. I highly recommend the book for laymen and legal scholars alike.
Wow, Tim Schultz, tell me something I don't know.
There is a great way for faith groups to define who they are working together. There's an organization called Faith Counts, faithcounts.com. The Seventh-day Adventist Church is a member of that with other great organizations like the Council of Christian Colleges and Universities. And it's a great way for churches and other religious groups to tell their stories about who they are.
Todd, tell me something I don't know.
The federal judge that is hearing the General Conference versus Horton case that we talked about earlier was also one of the first judges to put an injunction on President Trump during his first term when he had the immigration ban.
Wow. Great information, guys. Love talking to you all the time. We got to do this again soon. And thank you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our show. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.